Within a few hours, on the 25th of October 1415, some of France's richest warriors were dying without room to swing a sword. Men in armor lay pinned beneath other men. Horses thrashed in the mud. The living were pushed forward by thousands behind them, while English archers stepped in with axes, mallets, and knives. The French had begun the morning with the larger army, the heavier armor, and the road to Calais blocked. Henry V's exhausted troops appeared trapped. But the ground near Agincourt was not an open plain. Rain had soaked a freshly worked field. Woods narrowed both flanks. Wooden stakes guarded the archers. When the first French cavalry charge broke and recoiled, it churned the approach into something worse. Then the armored vanguard entered the same corridor. They believed numbers would crush the English line. Instead, every new rank removed another foot of space. The arrows wounded the formation. The funnel killed its ability to survive. The Battle of Agincourt did not begin on a muddy field. It began behind the walls of Harfleur, with clerks writing down the names of men too sick to continue. Henry V had landed in Normandy, expecting conquest to prove his claim to the French crown. Instead, the siege consumed more than a month. Disease moved through the crowded English camp faster than any French relief army. Men weakened by dysentery crowded near tents, carts, latrines, and siege works. Some could no longer march. Others could barely stand. When Harfleur surrendered on the 22nd of September 1415, Henry possessed the port he had come to take. But victory had already presented its bill. Records show that 300 men-at-arms and 900 archers were assigned to hold the captured town. Separate sick lists recorded men permitted to return to England because they were no longer fit for the campaign. Every name removed another bough, another armored body, or another servant from the column. Those lists survive because this was a paid army. Captains had to account for the men who had entered their service and explain why some were no longer present. A soldier sent home sick was not merely a casualty hidden inside a round number. He became a name beside a captain, a missing wage, and an empty place in a retinue. The port was a prize. It was also an anchor. Returning directly to England after one costly siege could make the expedition look smaller than the promises that had launched it. Henry instead chose a march across hostile territory toward English-held Calais. The decision was bold, but it was not a search for Agincourt. It was an attempt to turn a damaged campaign into a demonstration of control. On October 8, the surviving army left Harfleur. Behind them stood the new garrison. Across the channel went ships carrying invalids. Ahead lay more than 2 weeks of roads, river crossings, ration shortages, and French patrols. The men carried bows, arrows, lances, armor, cooking pots, and what food could still be gathered. They also carried the physical debt of Harfleur. Boots rubbed damaged feet. Empty stomachs shortened tempers. A soldier who had survived the siege could still collapse beside a road without seeing a French weapon. If Henry failed to reach Calais, his weakened army could be surrounded far from reinforcement and forced to surrender with its king. French commanders could exploit this. They did not need to storm Harfleur or attack prepared English positions. They could shadow the march, deny crossings, gather troops, and place themselves between Henry and safety. What looked like an English display of confidence was becoming a moving deadline. At the River Somme, French forces blocked the expected crossings. Henry's column was pushed inland, away from the direct route, spending more food and more days for every mile gained. Calais remained the destination, but the road no longer belonged to him. By late October, the English were not marching toward a glorious battlefield. They were marching toward the last open door, and the French army was moving to close it. On October 24, the last open door seemed to narrow into a strip of wet farmland. That morning, Henry's army crossed the River Ternoise at Blangy. As the column climbed the northern slope, scouts reported what the English had been trying to avoid for more than 2 weeks. The French army was ahead of them, standing across the road to Calais. Henry deployed for battle. The French did not attack. That decision made sense. More contingents were still arriving. The English were short of food, exhausted by more than 2 weeks of marching, and trapped between an enemy army and another cold night. Every hour of delay cost Henry more than it cost France. As darkness approached, both armies pulled back only far enough to sleep. The English settled around the small hamlet of Maisoncelles. French forces occupied ground around Agincourt, Ruisseauville, and the approaches farther north. Then the rain came. An English eyewitness described it falling in abundance for almost the entire night. French accounts remembered newly worked soil flooded into a quagmire. By dawn, the water had already altered what thousands of boots and hooves would do to the earth. The night sounded different on each side. Across the fields, French soldiers shouted for servants, companions, and men separated in the enormous camp. Fires burned beside horses, banners, saddles, and stacked weapons. Watches guarded the roads because the French believed Henry's smaller army might try to escape before morning. The English camp answered with silence. Henry ordered that no man call out. According to the campaign chronicle, a noble who broke the order risked losing his horse and harness. An archer risked his right ear. Beneath the rain, men lay among a few houses, gardens, and orchards without revealing how frightened, hungry, or disorganized they might be. From the French side, the quiet looked like fear. It was not yet a trap. It was discipline preserving the possibility of one. At dawn on Friday, October 25, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, the battlefield appeared almost simple. The French blocked the road north toward Calais. Henry's compact line formed to the south. Men-at-arms occupied the English centre, while archers were distributed along the flanks and among the battles. Modern estimates vary. One influential reconstruction places roughly 8,500 to 9,000 English against about 12,000 French. Others argue for a wider imbalance. France still had more men than the usable frontage could easily absorb. But the ground between them was not neutral space. Woods and groves around Agincourt and Tramecourt restricted movement at the sides. The worked earth lay open in the centre, wet enough to record every hoof and boot. The French had room to form several bodies of men, but not unlimited room to bring all of them forward at once. As those formations advanced south, their usable frontage would contract. The English could not leave. The French did not need to hurry. If Henry tried to march around the position, his column could be attacked while stretched along the road. If he remained still, hunger and arriving French reinforcements would make the imbalance worse. The larger army appeared to control the field because it controlled the time. But the same ground that blocked Henry's escape placed a boundary around French strength. From a distance, it looked like an open battlefield. From inside a moving formation, it would become a funnel. The French did have a plan. It was not simply to throw armored nobles at a wall of arrows and hope pride would carry them through. At the center of the army stood two experienced officers, Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, and Marshal Jean Le Mingre, known as Boucicaut. Both understood what English archers could do to an uncontrolled advance. France had learned that lesson at Crécy and Poitiers. Agincourt was supposed to be different. The army was arranged in three bodies. The vanguard and the main battle were built around men-at-arms who would fight on foot, where horses could not bolt beneath them. Several hundred chosen horsemen were placed toward the flanks. Their job was specific: strike the English archers, break their shooting line, and clear the way for the armored infantry. A smaller mounted force was intended to reach the English rear, where servants, horses, wagons, and baggage stood with little protection. Archers and crossbowmen were also present in significant numbers. In theory, they could answer the English arrows while the cavalry closed. Then the first mass of dismounted men-at-arms would cross the remaining ground with lances and swords. A second body under commanders, including the Dukes of Alençon and Bar, could follow, widen any opening, and finish the fight. On paper, each part protected the next. Now picture the field from d'Albret's position. Ahead stood a thin English army, whose center contained only a few thousand men-at-arms. Its wings were crowded with archers, wearing little armor. Behind them lay the road, the baggage, and a king who could not afford to be captured. If French cavalry reached either wing, Henry's entire formation could be opened from the side. That belief was rational. But the French plan required four things the field could not guarantee: clear lanes for cavalry, space for missile troops, distance between infantry formations, and obedience to a single command structure. By sunrise, the first compromises were already visible. France's greatest nobles crowded toward the front, where honor, witnesses, and valuable prisoners would be found. Banners accumulated around the vanguard. Men-at-arms filled the available frontage. The archers and crossbowmen, who should have helped prepare the assault, were pushed aside or behind bodies they could not shoot through. Status was beginning to rewrite tactics. The mounted wings faced a second problem. To strike the English archers, they had to pass between woods, cross wet, worked soil, and approach stakes that could not be outflanked easily. If the cavalry failed to clear the wings, the infantry would have to make the same advance under arrow fire. And if the horsemen recoiled into the men behind them, the opening attack would become an obstacle. Still, waiting appeared safer than moving. French soldiers sat near their banners, ate, adjusted straps, checked visors, and watched the smaller army opposite them. More French troops were still approaching. English food was running out. Time seemed to serve France. That logic created the first debt. The French had assembled a system designed to attack in sequence, but every hour of waiting packed more men, more rank, and more expectation behind the front. They believed numbers gave them options. On this field, numbers were already taking those options away. The plan was elegant, because each force had a role. The danger was that Henry only had to disrupt the first one. For hours after sunrise, neither army moved. The French had every reason to remain where they were. Their numbers were growing. Henry's food was not. The English stood between woods, mud, and an enemy blocking the northern road. Time was doing work that French weapons had not yet begun. Henry could not allow that work to continue. Sometime later that morning, he gave the order to advance. The English line did not surge forward like an attacking army. It moved as a compact system. Men-at-arms held the center beneath royal and noble banners. Thousands of archers shifted with them on the wings and around the smaller armored formations. Each archer carried more than a bow. Before the battle, English archers had prepared sharpened wooden stakes long enough to stop or wound a charging horse. They had planted them at an angle in front of their positions. Now those defenses had to move with the army. The stakes came out of the wet earth. Archers lifted bows, arrow bags, mallets, and the heavy lengths of timber. Then the entire English formation advanced several hundred yards across the ground, separating the armies. This was not the act of a commander who had discovered safety. It was a calculated exposure. While the archers were moving, their wooden barrier did not exist. Their light armor offered little protection against mounted men-at-arms. If French cavalry attacked before the stakes were planted again, the English wings could be broken open in minutes. One successful charge might reach the center, scatter the archers, and leave Henry surrounded. But the French did not strike during the movement. From their line, the advance could be read as desperation. The smaller army had abandoned ground it had occupied all night. Henry appeared to be shortening the distance because hunger and delay had left him no alternative. That interpretation was partly correct. The English were under pressure, but Henry was choosing where that pressure would be released. The line stopped within effective longbow range. Archers drove the stakes into the soaked soil again, hammering them forward with wooden mallets. The points faced the French. Gaps remained wide enough for English men to move through, but dangerous for horses approaching at speed. The battlefield layout was now complete. English men-at-arms formed the hard center. Archers occupied the wings and spaces around them. Stakes guarded the most vulnerable approaches. Woods near Agincourt and Tramecourt made a wide flanking movement difficult. Directly ahead stood the French vanguard, with mounted troops positioned to attack the archers and dismounted men-at-arms waiting behind them. The French could see the thin English line. They could see archers with little armor. They could see a king who had moved closer. What they could not see was how little room their own formations would have once the first attack began to recoil. Thomas Erpingham, the veteran associated with command of the archers, helped bring the deployment into order. The signal was given. Bows rose across the line. The first volleys did not need to kill thousands. They only needed to make waiting more dangerous than moving. Arrows climbed, turned, and fell among the French formations. Horses shifted beneath their riders. Men lowered visors. Commands passed along banners and mounted companies. The larger army had controlled the morning by refusing to attack. Henry had now taken that choice away. The English had moved first because remaining still meant defeat. But by moving closer, they forced France to fight on ground that was already beginning to choose the order of destruction. The first French attack began with a problem that no commander could repair once the horses were moving. The cavalry assigned to strike the English archers was not at full strength. Some chroniclers later claimed that men had drifted away to warm themselves, feed their mounts, or simply failed to assemble when the order came. Whatever the exact reason, the charge that formed was smaller and less coordinated than the plan required. Cligney de Brabant and Louis de Bosredon had been given a clear task. Their horsemen were to break the archers on the English wings before the dismounted vanguard crossed the field. From the saddle, the target still looked vulnerable. The archers wore little armor. The stakes were not a stone wall. If even one mounted group punched through, thousands of English archers could be scattered before they changed weapons. Then the horses began to move. They had to accelerate across soil already softened by a night of rain. Woods and dense growth restricted the space available at the sides. The riders could not simply spread outward, pass around the stakes, and strike from a clean flank. Their approach was narrowed toward the points Henry's archers had planted in the mud. The first arrows rose before the cavalry reached them. At long range, good French armor could resist many hits. The horses were another matter. Even where their heads were protected, much of the body remained exposed. Arrows did not need to kill an animal immediately. Pain was enough. A wounded horse could rear, turn sideways, collide with another mount, or refuse the obstacle ahead. The charge began to lose its shape. Riders lowered their heads, reins pulled hard against frightened mouths. Lances that had pointed toward the English line swung across neighboring horses. Some animals fell. Others veered toward gaps that were already closing. Ahead waited the stakes. Behind waited the French vanguard. If the horsemen could not break through, they needed room to slow, turn, and withdraw. That room no longer existed. Thousands of dismounted men-at-arms were beginning to move forward behind them. The mounted assault failed before it could destroy the archers. But failure did not stop at the point where the horses turned. It traveled backward. Wounded and panicked mounts recoiled toward the advancing infantry. A French account described horses crashing into the men behind them, scattering ranks and trampling some underfoot. Banners tilted. Men stepped aside to avoid hooves, only to collide with comrades packed beside them. Officers trying to restore alignment were fighting the momentum of animals that no longer obeyed orders. The cavalry had been sent to clear a road. Instead, it tore that road apart. Hooves cut into the wet-worked soil. Fallen horses became obstacles. Armored riders and broken lances marked the lanes the infantry now had to cross. Every turn, collision, and struggle mixed water with earth until the surface held deeper prints and softer patches. The English archers remained behind their stakes. The French men-at-arms remained committed to the advance. From the rear, the first attack may not have looked catastrophic. The horsemen had failed, but the armored vanguard still contained some of France's richest and most experienced fighters. The English line remained thin. D'Albret and Boucicaut could not easily halt everything, reorganize the cavalry, bring the missile troops forward, and begin again. Arrows were still falling. Men were already moving. Honor and command had become tied to continuing. That was the decision debt. The cavalry had failed to remove the archers. Now the infantry would have to cross the entire field under their fire, and it would cross on ground the cavalry had just made worse. The French believed the first attack had been repulsed. In reality, it had completed the battlefield. The cavalry had failed, but the battle was not yet decided. Behind the broken horsemen, the first body of French men-at-arms moved beneath the banners of Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut. Dukes, counts, bannerets, household knights, and professional soldiers entered the same field the cavalry had just crossed. Their armor protected them from many arrows. It also demanded balance, breath, and firm ground. The ground offered none. Woods restricted movement on both sides. Ahead, English men-at-arms held the center, while archers spread around the wings behind sharpened stakes. Behind the French vanguard, more formations pressed south, without seeing where the front had slowed. Between them lay several hundred yards of wet, worked earth cut by hooves, fallen horses, broken lances, and thousands of footprints. The French front could not spread wide enough to use its full weight. It could only move deeper. Arrows continued to fall. Men lowered visors and bent their heads. Some were struck in the face, joints, hands, or other exposed points. Many survived and kept walking. This was not a formation being erased at long range. It was being forced to spend strength before the real fight began. Every step pulled at a boot. Every fallen man made the next step less certain. The ranks behind denied the front time to avoid bodies or find firmer ground. One French account described men sinking into the mud as far as their knees. The language may be dramatic, but the physical problem was real. Armor did not make a man helpless. Exhaustion, restricted vision, slippery soil, and another armored body pressing into his back could. If the vanguard lost its footing before reaching the English line, the attack would collapse under arrows without using its swords. So the French kept moving. Now picture the final approach from inside a closed visor. The English were no longer distant. The men heard voices, scraping armor, and breath hammering inside their helmets. Survival seemed to require one final effort. Then the first rank struck. The French hit the English center hard enough to force it backward. The Gester later claimed Henry's line yielded roughly the length of a lance. For a moment, the French reading appeared correct. They had endured the arrows, crossed the mud, and brought their armored mass against a smaller enemy. To the Duke of Alençon and the men behind him, movement in the English line looked like collapse. It was the last useful illusion of the day. The front ranks needed space to fight. A man with a sword or polyaxe required room to raise, turn, and recover his weapon. Instead, shoulders met shoulders, visors pressed against backs. The second French body continued pushing toward a fight it could not see. The force behind the attack no longer reached the English. It reached the French front rank. Men who stumbled disappeared beneath boots and armor. Those standing could not step backward because the mass behind continued forward. They could not spread sideways because the field narrowed and English archers occupied the margins. The French had reached the English line. That was the moment escape became hardest. Henry fought among his men-at-arms while the center absorbed the impact. If that line broke before the pressure stalled, the king could be killed or captured and the campaign would end in a single opening. But it did not break quickly enough. The archers fired until the range vanished, then laid down their bows. Carrying swords, axes, pole weapons, and heavy wooden mallets used to drive stakes, they moved into the churned edges. Wearing less armor, they attacked men whose attention remained fixed toward the English center. The French mass was now struck from the front and both sides, while its own rear kept pushing. A gap around Henry, or one coordinated surge, could still tear the center apart. Instead, each new French rank increased the compression. The battlefield had turned reinforcement into weight. D'Albret fell. Boucicaut was captured. Alençon fought near the English king and died in the melee. As banners dropped and officers vanished inside the crush, orders could no longer move through the formation faster than panic. The door closed without a gate. It closed when the men at the front could no longer advance, the men behind could no longer stop, and the men on the ground could no longer rise. The arrows imposed exhaustion and disorder. The funnel made recovery impossible. The French front had collapsed, but the English army had not yet escaped danger. For perhaps 2 or 3 hours, the fighting had remained concentrated around the English standards. Now the pressure loosened. Men began pulling survivors from beneath bodies and broken weapons. French nobles removed helmets, surrendered swords, and gave names that might later be converted into ransom. To an English archer or man-at-arms, a living prisoner could be worth more than anything lying in the mud. That value created a new weakness. The English were still exhausted and scattered. While the prisoners gathering behind their line required guards the army could barely spare. A captor might be watching several armored men while also searching for wounded companions. Bows lay on the ground. Formation had dissolved into clusters of fighters, captives, horses, and discarded equipment. Then the alarm came from the rear. Reports spread that fresh French cavalry and the surviving rearguard were reforming. At roughly the same time, a local raiding party, often linked in later accounts to the knight Yezembart d'Agincourt, struck the lightly protected English baggage. They seized royal possessions, including valuable objects associated with Henry himself. The timing and relationship between these events remained disputed, but inside the English position, the distinctions scarcely mattered. They had heard that an enemy force was gathering. They knew their baggage had been penetrated, and a large body of prisoners stood inside the English position. If the French attacked again while the captives rose against their guards, victory could become encirclement. Henry responded with the most controversial order of the battle. The prisoners were to be killed. The command cut directly across the economics of medieval war. Captors had risked their lives to secure men whose families might pay enormous sums for their release. Later accounts claim that some English soldiers resisted the order, until a separate group was assigned to carry it out. The highest-ranking captives, including the Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon, and a small number of other illustrious men, were spared. No reliable total survives for those killed under the order, and no single motive can be isolated with certainty. Fear of the French rearguard, the attack on the baggage, the number of captives, and the exhaustion of the English army all formed part of the crisis. What matters is what Henry believed in that moment. He did not yet see a finished victory. He saw a small army whose line had opened, whose rear had been touched, and whose prisoners might become another enemy formation. The same compression that had destroyed the French assault had now produced a mass the English could not safely control. Henry moved toward the remaining French threat. The rearguard did not launch the decisive counterattack he feared. Its formations withdrew, leaving carriages, draft horses, provisions, lances, bows, and weapons behind. Only then did the battlefield become quiet enough to understand. The French system had not failed at one point. It had failed in sequence: cavalry, vanguard, second line, command, and finally the ability to recover. But the prisoner order left a stain no tactical explanation could remove. Agincourt had become an impossible English victory. It had also revealed what fear could make a victorious king do before he trusted that the killing was over. By evening, the road to Calais was open. Modern estimates often place French deaths near 6,000, though no final count can be certain. Among them were the Constable of France, leading nobles, bannerets, and commanders whose loss reached far beyond the field. English losses were dramatically smaller. Modern archival work has identified at least 112 English dead by name, while narrative sources and later estimates give higher totals. Henry did not conquer France that day. He continued to Calais, crossed back to England, and turned survival into political triumph. Agincourt strengthened his authority and later helped support renewed campaigns in Normandy. But it did not end the 100 Years' War, and it did not prove that one weapon had made armor obsolete. The longbow mattered. So did the stakes, the horses, the rain, the woods, the command failures, and the pressure of men who could not see what was happening ahead. Mud alone did not kill the French army. It removed the space that allowed the army to function. That was the final irony. France had placed its richest, best armored, and most socially important warriors at the point of greatest honor. The narrow field concentrated them at the point of greatest danger. When the survivors left, helmets, broken lances, abandoned banners, and bodies remained in the worked earth. Rainwater gathered inside steel that had not been strong enough to create room. The French entered Agincourt, believing mass would crush a weaker enemy. The field made that mass crush itself. Subscribe for more hidden turning points where terrain, deception, and forgotten details broke armies that looked unbeatable.